Okay, we're going to try and change a clutch on a Fiat 124 Spider. This is a 1978 version. Pulled off my gear shift knob, and now I'm going to try and pry up this plate. It's got two little snaps that snap into fittings down there, so I'm going to try and pry them up from the edge here. This is actually wood, but it's got a metal base under it. And we'll see if we can do this. Okay, I pulled the ashtray out. That gave me better leverage, and I found the edge of the little metal plate and managed to pop it up here. You can see the little pins hanging down that fit in the sockets. So we will remove this thing. It's not attached to the front, it just pulls out and then pulls up, and the whole thing's off, and there's the shift lever. Okay. One of the trickier things on this to get started is to pull the chrome part off of your stick shift, because with the chrome part on, it's way too long to get down to drop the transmission down. But to get the chrome part off, you have to push the chrome part down and then pry under the edge. You'll see a little white thing peeking out, and as you pry her out, you'll finally pry this little circular wedge thing out, and once you get that out, the whole thing will pop off. So you push the whole thing down and then pry this out from under, and then you can pull the chrome part off, and then you're good to go. Okay, next is 6 bolts on the flexible coupler right behind the transmission. They're all 19 millimeters, so I just put a wrench on one end and put a wrench on the other, and give them a good twist, and they will loosen up. They're not horribly tight, but they're pretty darn tight. To unscrew the speedo cable, you'd think you just put a pair of pliers on it, but it's in kind of a tight space, so what I found worked was getting a long screwdriver and putting it up against the little knurl things and hitting that with a hammer gently, and believe it or not, it will slowly start spinning this thing counterclockwise and unscrew it. And once you get it loosened up, then you can just go up there with your fingers and finish the job. When you get it out, you'll see it's just a square end on the cable that fits into the little thing sticking out up there. So that's all there is to that. Okay, I've disconnected my return spring on my clutch fork, and now it's time to deal with the bolts for the starter. And there's 3 of them. 2 of them are easy to access, one there and one just above it. But the other one is way up over the hump here. And based on where these 2 bolts are, you can sort of feel your way up and over the side of the transmission till you get to the 3rd bolt. I found to loosen it, what worked best was it's a 13 millimeter with a U-joint and an extension, and just put it on a ratchet wrench and stuff the whole thing up the side of the transmission and loosen it up. Once I loosened it up, I actually popped the ratchet wrench off and put another extension on the end of this, and then I could just back it off by hand. So got that bolt out, and now the other two bolts should be pretty easy. Okay, to loosen up the upper transmission bolt on the driver's side, I've got a socket and a universal joint going to an extension, and another extension, and another extension, and there's my ratchet wrench way back behind the flexible donut thing, and that's how I could do it. For the passenger side upper transmission bolt, you can actually get to it fairly easily from the engine compartment. Here's my wrench here, and the bolt is around the corner. Can't really see it on the camera, but the good news is it's pretty easily accessible from up here. By the way, don't forget to disconnect the 3 wire connectors up here by the stick shift so that you don't pull any wires. I already removed the plate from the front of the flywheel here. It's just a couple 13mm and I think it's a 17mm bolts. And now I've got 2 13mm bolts on the bracket between the transmission and the exhaust that I'm going to pull off. Oops, make that 3 bolts. There's the 2 underneath, and then there's 1 up here around back. So you've got 3 bolts on this bracket between the exhaust pipe and the transmission. So now the only thing I have left holding the transmission in, hopefully, are the 2 lower bolts up at the front and the bracket at the back. I think those are 2 13mm bolts back there, and the 2 19mm bolts attaching the transmission to the engine block. So we'll pop those out, and the jack is already in place, and we'll see what happens. Even with the donut, the bolts out of the donut, it still was not obvious to me how the transmission was going to slide backwards and get the transmission shaft out of the engine. So what I ended up doing is taking the bolts out of the supports for the drive shaft and dropping that down, and now there's nothing to impede it from backing out. You do have to make sure that the brackets are not being pinned by the bolts coming down, but once you back that down, then you can sort of start prying it away from the engine block. Okay, someone said all you have to do is remove the plate around the shift lever to do this job, but the shift lever, because it's bent backwards, hangs up on the edge of the console. So push comes to shove, you actually have to get the console up and shift it backwards to get that gear level to clear the edge here and get down the hole. So you might as well just go ahead and pull up the console before you start doing all this, because otherwise it's going to be a problem. Okay, I got my new clutch and got the plate, and I'm going to pre-clean it with brake clean. I'm using my little plastic gloves so I don't get my little fingerprints all over it. So I'm going to clean this, clean the disc, and the fat part of the disc goes into the clutch plate so that it's pretty thin when you turn it on its side. What didn't come with this was the alignment tool, and you got to have this to get the damn thing in, so make sure you get the alignment tool. And then I have the throwout bearing, which is really the problem that's causing all this. And then I have my torque wrench set on 22 foot-pounds, because that's what the specs say to tighten the bolts of the pressure plate onto the flywheel. And I will also clean off the flywheel with my brake clean, and we will go from there. Okay, so I cleaned off the face of my flywheel, and I have my disc in place being held by the alignment tool. And now I'm just going to put the rest of the clutch on top of that, and watching for the little pins and holes on the side for the bolts to tell you how to line it up. And we will slip it over. Okay, so now it's placed in position. The little bolts that hold it to the flywheel are just long enough to grab the threads, and then you will slowly tighten them down in sort of a stepped fashion to pull the spring down and get the clutch down on the flywheel. When you first put the clutch body over the disc, there's a fair amount of wiggle room because the plate isn't pressing down yet. But as you get the bolts closer to tightness, then adjust your alignment tool to make sure it's in the center of the little fingers here, because if you don't have it perfectly aligned, you'll never get the transmission to slide in there. Okay, everything is torqued to specs. The 22 foot-pounds is not a whole lot of torque, but apparently it's enough. Now, once you start torquing them down, the crankshaft is going to spin unless you fix it somehow. You can either wedge something in the flywheel gears, or I put an 1.5 inch socket on the front of the crankshaft and stuck a wrench on that and jammed it onto the chassis so it won't spin. And now obviously pull out your alignment tool before inserting transmission. One other thing, I also have these little dowels of metal here stuck in the bolt holes for the transmission to engine block bolts. I've got one on each side down on the lower part to try and help align the transmission when I try and slide it on. Okay, the throwout bearing is truly engineering elegance. It snaps over here, and if you pull it away from the snap, pull the lever here away, so I'm going to pull it this way, and it unsnaps from the ball, and when you do that, it unlocks the bearing. It's just got a little thing that hooks in the back there, so you pull one off, you push the new one on, get it through the big hole, and then you just snap it back over the little thingy there, and you're done. That is truly elegant. Okay, you'll never guess what's going on here. To get the transmission back up into place in a controlled manner, I'm not going to try and clean and jerk it and stuff it up in there. So I've run a steel pole through my vent windows and have nylon webbing going down to the back of the transmission. Okay, so right now my transmission is basically on the floor. It's got a little dolly in the back there. And to get it back up into position, it needs to go both up, and then once you get it lined up, go forward to get the shaft back into the engine and through the clutch. So I've got a strap in the back going around under the bottom and back up top to that pole, and I've got one of those little clicky levers to ratchet it skyward, and I've got a strap hooked through a hole in the chassis here, going down under the front of the transmission and up to the corresponding hole on the other side, again with a ratchet lever here, and that lifts up the front, And finally I've got a strap running from the sway bar going along back, around back, and back up to the sway bar, and that's to ratchet it forward. So once I lift it up and get the shaft aligned, then I can ratchet this other one and swing it forward and hopefully get it in the hole without having to strain my back or anything like that. Again, I'd like to point out that everybody talks about doing this with the drive shaft left in place, but how you would get the transmission to slide back with the drive shaft actually in its normal position is beyond me. And I like to have good access to the flywheel to get the clutch on and then slide the whole thing back together again. So dropping the forward into the drive shaft is only a matter of a couple bolts, so it seems to me well worth the effort. So here I am slowly raising my transmission on its clicky straps, which really does seem to work rather well. But you have to keep checking your stick shift to make sure it's coming up through the appropriate hole and it's not getting jammed. And I also have some fishing line tied to the wires on top of the transmission going up over the pole in the passenger compartment with a weight on the end so that they will be pulled up through the hole and I won't lose them because they all have to be reconnected when I get the transmission in place. So I'll just keep clicking and raising the tranny up here. One of the surprising things about this is as you're getting it close, you can actually check your alignment through the porthole here in the side of the transmission where the fork for the release bearing is. It's kind of handy. So I've got the transmission up on its straps, and now I'm cranking the strap that's pulling it forward. The nice thing about having it on the straps is you can actually kind of wiggle it around and feel it, the shaft going in the right hole there. I also put a jack under the nose of the engine and tilted it back just a little bit to try and help all this. And I'm still keeping an eye on the shift lever up in the passenger compartment. Okay, I've now got it far enough in that I can actually get the lower bolts started on the threads. I did have to cheat and put it on a bottle jack on a little dolly thing for the final scoot forward because the straps in the back were actually holding the whole thing back. So the straps are just there for safety's sake. The little bottle jack's holding up the back, and that enabled me to scoot it forward and get it inserted and get those bolts started. Now I'll try and get the upper bolts. Okay, back up top here, stick shift. There's my 3 wires that are attached to the transmission that are tied together with a piece of fishing line that I had on a weight to keep them pulled up as the transmission was coming up. But now that it's in place, now I have to do is reconnect my connectors here. Okay, everything is back and reinstalled and ready for a testing to see how the clutch adjustment is. I moved the thing about halfway along till there wasn't any free play and then snugged it up a little bit more, and we'll see how it does. One comment is the fork for the throwout bearing that I thought was such an elegant thing. As I was putting the transmission back on the engine, it slid back and unsnapped itself, so it was a pain in the ass. I did manage to get it hooked back up without having to pull the transmission off, but what I would probably do is when you first replace the throwout bearing and put the fork in, I would tape it or something to make sure it doesn't slide out, or put the spring on or something to keep it in place. Okay, to get that plastic pinch pin back up under the chrome shift knob, what I did was put a block of wood there, push down on the lever, got some pliers with adjustable opening, so it just squeezed in, and then wedged it and shoved while pushing down on this and making sure the